Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this edition of the 700 Club. Tomorrow is what's known as Super Tuesday. Many states will be voting in the Republican primary, about 600 delegates at stake. It could be closed up for Donald Trump. He may, as he said, run the table, or maybe somebody else could emerge as a credible candidate. But putting a new justice on the Supreme Court, getting rid of President Obama's illegal executive actions, and defeating ISIS. These were some of the topics Republican presidential candidate Ted Cruz took on when I spoke with him at Regent University, our candidate forum on Friday night.
Cruz opened the evening with a brief speech to the capacity crowd at Regent, and he took questions from the audience after his interview with Pat. Gary Lane has the highlights.
Ted Cruz arrived to a standing ovation from the predominantly evangelical conservative audience. He quickly got down to business, explaining that constitutional rights and religious freedoms are at stake in the next presidential election.
Just a few days ago, I attended Justice Scalia's funeral. He was someone who had been a personal friend, someone I'd known for 20 years. And he was a lion of the law, a fierce defender of the Bill of Rights. And his passing underscores that the stakes of this presidential election are not just one, but two branches of government. We are one liberal justice away from a 5-justice left-wing majority, the likes of which this country has never seen, that will undermine our basic rights. You know, as Jay mentioned, before I was in the Senate, I was the Solicitor General of Texas, the chief lawyer for the state in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. We brought together a coalition of states defending the federal ban on partial birth abortion, and we won 5-4. 5-4. Another case from my tenure as Solicitor General, we defended the Ten Commandments monument that stands on the state capitol grounds in Texas. We went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and we won 5-4. We are one liberal justice away from the Supreme Court ordering veterans memorials torn down all over this country. And I'll tell you, we're not far away from the court ordering the chisels to come out to remove the crosses and the stars of David from the tombstones of fallen soldiers. You know, Justice Scalia's most notable majority opinion was the case of Heller versus District of Columbia. That's a case I know very, very well, because in that case, I represented 31 states defending the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And we won 5-4. The position of the 4 dissenters was that the Second Amendment does not protect any individual right to keep and bear arms whatsoever, that it is only a collective right of the militia, which is nothing but fancy lawyer talk for a non-existent right. One more liberal justice, and the court will overturn Heller and conclude that not a single one of us has any individual right to keep and bear arms whatsoever, that the government can make it a crime for any of us to own a firearm, and none of us can challenge that in court. That's what the stakes are in this election.
Regent University Chancellor Pat Robertson sat down with Senator Cruz to discuss some hot topic campaign issues. Dr. Robertson wanted to know what Cruz would do on his first day as president.
Rescind every single illegal and unconstitutional executive action that Barack Obama has taken.
The nice thing about that, you don't need any congressional approval. You can do that by a stroke of the pen as president.
That is exactly right. And, you know, that's been what Obama's abused. But the silver lining is everything done with executive power can be undone with executive power. That's why every one of those orders can be rescinded by the president on day one. It's why I've also pledged on day one to instruct the Department of Justice to open an investigation into Planned Parenthood and to prosecute any and all criminal violence.
Does that include an inquiry into Hillary Clinton's emails?
Yes.
Well, I interrupt as you keep going on your proposal. What are you going to do?
So the third thing I'll do on day one is instruct every federal agency that the persecution of religious liberty ends that day.
Yeah.
Now, all three of those can be done via executive power. Mm-hmm. The second avenue for changing the direction of the ship of state is foreign policy, and foreign policy likewise can change overnight. So on day one, I intend to rip to shreds this catastrophic Iranian nuclear deal. And likewise, on day one, I intend to begin the process of moving the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, the once and eternal capital. And presidents for years keep waiving it. And the reason they waive it, it's not complicated. They say, well, gosh, if we move the embassy to Jerusalem, it'll make other folks in the Middle East really, really unhappy with us. Well, if you hadn't noticed, they're already really unhappy with us. And that statement, look, for 7 years, we've been abandoning our friends and allies. Mm-hmm. And we've been showing weakness and appeasement to our enemies. And that act of moving the embassy in Jerusalem, it's the right thing to do, but it's also a powerful statement to Israel, to our allies, and to our enemies that America is back. And that...
Dr. Robertson asked the Republican presidential candidate to explain how he would defeat the Islamic State.
The president absolutely refuses to identify ISIS for what it is. What would you do with this Islamic extremist? What are you going to do with them?
You are absolutely right. This president, he refuses even to utter the words, yes, radical Islamic terrorism. And indeed, he often acts as an apologist for radical Islamic terrorism, giving excuses, giving justifications, comparing it to the Crusades or the Inquisitions. Listen, ISIS is the face of evil. Yeah. I think we need to start with a president that lays out the objective. We will utterly defeat radical Islamic terrorism. We will utterly destroy ISIS. And once the commander-in-chief lays out that objective, I think we need to use overwhelming air power. Mm-hmm. And we need to combine it. You mentioned the Peshmerga, the fighting forces of the Kurds. We should be arming the Kurds. Yes. They're fighting ISIS right now. ISIS is using American military equipment they seized in Iraq. President Obama refuses to arm the Kurds because of political reasons that it would upset Baghdad. We ought to let them be our boots on the ground. And between overwhelming air power and the Kurds, and then beyond that, we may well need to embed special forces to direct our air power. But if and when we do that, you know, one of the saddest aspects of the last 7 years has been the president sending our fighting men and women into combat with rules of engagement that essentially tie their arms behind their back where they can't defend themselves.
Jay Sekulow of the American Center for Law and Justice appeared as moderator for the Regent Candidate Forum. He took questions from the audience, and one wanted to know what Cruz would do to fix the Veterans Administration.
You know, a couple of months ago, Hillary said that she thought the scandal at the VA was not that big a deal. It was blown out of proportion. I think that's completely wrong. When you have government officials lying, keeping bogus books, wrongfully denying veterans potentially life-saving care that they've earned and they deserve, I think it is a scandal and it's an outrage. Two things will change if I'm president. Number one, there will be accountability. Anyone who wrongfully denied care will be terminated. Anyone who violated the criminal law will be prosecuted. But number two, Jay, the most important reform is fundamental reform, which is we need to give veterans the right to choose their own doctor. If you want to go to the VA doctor, fine. But there's no reason why veterans shouldn't be able to go to the cardiologist down the street at the private hospital. That competition is the best thing to fix the problem, giving veterans the health care that they've earned and they deserve. And as president, that's what I intend to do.
Sekulow asked the Texas senator about Planned Parenthood.
They have these exposés, discloses what Planned Parenthood's doing. In Texas, your state, grand jury in Houston, in investigating the case, doesn't issue an indictment against Planned Parenthood, but rather against the videographers that reported the crime. You're president of the United States. What do you do?
Well, listen, it was disgraceful and very disappointing what happened with the Harris County DA. That was wrong. And you know, you look at those videos. Listen, as believers, I think those videos presented an enormous opportunity and still present an enormous opportunity to move people's hearts and minds. You know, I've encouraged Americans, whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, especially if you call yourself pro-choice, to watch those videos. And just ask, are those my values as you see Planned Parenthood officials laughing, sipping Chardonnay, and callously, heartlessly selling the body parts of unborn children? Now, one of the reasons why I pledged on day one to direct the Department of Justice to open an investigation is because in addition to being horrific and grossly immoral and shocking, it is also a federal crime. Federal criminal law makes it a felony with 10 years in prison to sell the body parts of an unborn child for profit. Now, on the face of the videos, you see them bargaining to sell the body parts of unborn children. Their only legal defense, plausibly, is they could argue it was not for profit, and that would be presumably litigated in the course of a criminal prosecution. And yet, just like we were talking about Hillary indictment, nobody thinks there's any chance the Obama Justice Department would even begin to investigate this, because Planned Parenthood is such a political ally of the Democrats that even though they're caught on film apparently committing a pattern of felonies,
right,
they are immune from prosecution. And I will say this is one of the areas where I've got a very sharp difference of opinion with Donald Trump. You know, Donald has said in the last couple of debates that he thinks Planned Parenthood is wonderful.
Let me ask you these debates. I ran, you know, in '88, and we were under the Reagan 11th commandment, thou shalt not speak ill of any fellow Republican. And we kept our mouths shut. Yeah. I was in a debate where Bob Strauss tried to get me to attack George Bush, and I wouldn't do it. And Strauss said, I told you it wouldn't work, you know, but we wouldn't do that. I have never seen anything like it. I mean, calling a fellow candidate a con man and things like that. Doesn't that grieve you as you're part of you've been to those debates?
Look, I think that's exactly right. You know, I remember well when you ran for president in '88. Yeah. Both my mom and dad were volunteers on your presidential campaign.
Your dad told me he voted. That may have been his first vote, but it shows how smart your family is.
You know, there is no doubt that this cycle, it has gotten nasty and personal in a way that you have to go back a long time to find another race this way. You know, my approach from the beginning is I can't control what others do, but I can control what I do. And so the way I have tried to approach it is if others impugn my integrity, I mean, they have thrown some nasty insults my way. They've gone after my character. They've gone after my integrity. I don't respond in kind. I don't respond in insults, and I'm not going to. Now, I do think policy is fair game, that politics, that should be the meat of politics, is comparing your record to another candidate's record, your vision to another candidate's vision, but I'm not going to engage in insults. And I'll tell you really what I'm trying to follow is the biblical principle that if you repay unkindness with kindness, that it's like heaping coals on top of their head. And so that has been my approach, and it's how I intend to continue regardless of what other people say.
The event concluded about an hour after it began, with Dr. Robertson thanking Senator Cruz for making a campaign appearance at Regent University.
You've been so nice to be with us, and this has been a very stimulating discussion. We wish you the very best.
Well,
God bless you. Thank you.